Hello, my name is Ron Patkus. I'm head of special collections here in the library and also a member of the history department. We're here in the special collections library for this classroom visit, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the most beautiful of all printed books, William Morris's Kelmscott Chaucer. We're going to do that not only by listening to me, but we're going to draw on some of the wonderful treasures that we have in the Special Collections Department, specifically 2 copies of the Kelmscott Chaucer and then a facsimile, a fine press facsimile that was printed in the 20th century. I think what I'll do is first give you an introduction, a little bit of a background to these books, and then we'll walk through them and I'll show them to you closely. So I think we're about ready to start. The place to start is that title that I gave you, the most beautiful of all printed books. That is a quote actually from the famous Irish poet William Butler Yeats. Yeats had actually been given a copy of the Kelmscott Chaucer on his 40th birthday. He was born in 1865, so that was 1905. A number of his friends, famous literati of the time, had gathered and given him this book, and he had this reaction, calling it, as I say, the most beautiful of all printed books. That feeling was actually shared by other people in addition to Yeats. He wasn't the only one. When the book was first printed in 1896, immediately many critics saw this as a very important book and gave great praise to it. And even coming down to our own time, many people today can continue to see this as a remarkable achievement in the history of printing. In fairness, not everyone holds that this book maybe is the most beautiful of all. Some people might not connect with Morris's sense of aesthetics in the same way. But everyone, I think, has to hold that this book is very important in the history of printing, and so therefore a very appropriate book for us to look at today. Vassar, as I say, is very fortunate to have 2 original copies of the Kelmscott Chaucer and then a fine press facsimile. So whenever we talk about this book in the classes I teach, which are on the history of books and printing, it's wonderful that we can actually look at some true examples, and students can have a very close view of these books. And they're not just looking at a picture of it on a screen. To me, it makes all the difference. Also, in terms of background, maybe we should say a little bit about William Morris. William Morris was one of the great Victorian artists and thinkers. He was born in 1834, died in 1896. Therefore, his life was almost exactly the years of the reign of Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. So his life spans the Victorian period. And yet Morris, in many ways, rejected much of the historical activities in the Victorian period, especially the movement toward industrialization and urbanization. He instead looked toward an earlier time, and this is why he became an important figure in the arts and crafts movement, which was looking toward earlier examples of life and aesthetics. Morris grew up in a well-to-do family. As a young man, he attended Oxford University, and while there he met some friends who became friends for life, such as Edward Burne-Jones, who was the illustrator for the Kelmscott Chaucer that we'll be looking at shortly. Initially, he thought maybe that he would pursue a career in the church, but he turned away from that. He became very interested in the medieval period. And eventually, after graduating, he decided to work on his own, and he eventually founded a company which was called Morris and Company. And it had various names throughout its existence. But this company was headed by Morris, and they would produce a number of crafts and types of craftsman work for members of English society. So for instance, furniture, or textiles, or tiles, or stained glass, a whole wide range of furnishings that could be used. And Morris brought his entire aesthetic to this. It was only toward the end of his life that Morris actually became very interested in printing. As I mentioned earlier, he died in 1896. His printing press, the first book from it, came out in 1891. He named this press the Kelmscott Press after Kelmscott Manor, which was a house in the Cotswolds that he often visited. Morris's interest in printing is not too much of a surprise because he had long been interested in books and in writing. He himself, you may know, was the author of a number of books, but he also would create his own books, manuscript versions, I mean. And so his interest in this kind of work is not too much of a surprise, but as I say, it comes toward the end of his life. 1891, the first book of the Kelmscott Press is printed. And Morris, in establishing this, this project, of course, again wants to recall the earlier times. So these books are very reminiscent of the first printers in the 15th and 16th centuries. And they recall many of those same ideals that they worked with, rather than those of industrial society, which was all around Morris in the late 19th century. And we'll see that as we take a look. This was not only Morris's project, though he, of course, had a number of people helping him, illustrators, binders, pressmen, etc. So we don't want to focus only on, although we'll be focusing on Morris, we want to acknowledge that there were a number of people involved in the work of the Kelmscott Press. This was a private press. This was a private press that was basically doing what Morris wanted to do. The books were sold, but it wasn't a trade press in the usual way that many books were printed at that time. So with that as background on Morris I should also say the Kelmscott Press during Morris's life, they produced about 50 books. They actually published a few more after his death, and so the time span of the Kelmscott Press is from 1891 to 1898, a very short period, but very important for the 1890s. And of those books printed, Vassar has about a third of them. We're very happy to have those, and we can use them in teaching. But certainly the most important of those books is what is called the Kelmscott Chaucer. And I think now we'll start taking a closer look at these examples that we have here. So the first copy of the Kelmscott Chaucer that we have is here. You can see that this book was actually adopted by the family of Charlotte Jones. This book, you can see, is in a very simple binding. And this was the original binding that the book came out from the Kelmscott Press. Morris wanted his books to come out in these simple bindings. Sometimes they were like this, quarter linen and boards. Sometimes they were a limp vellum. But he saw these bindings especially as temporary bindings, and that the owner would acquire the book and perhaps later have their own binding put on. So it's very simple. As we open this book, we can see that this was given to us by Elizabeth Howe. She was a member of the class of 1882, a very active member in her alumni group. Her husband was actually the founder of the Library of Ophthalmology at Harvard. This book came to Vassar in 1911, so it's been here in the library for a little over 100 years. And for all of that time has really been one of our highlights. As I turn the pages, I'm not sure if you can hear that on the camera, but there's a lovely rattle to the paper which indicates to us that this is handmade paper. And if you look closely, you can see the lines in the paper which show us that. We can also see a watermark if we look closely at the pages. And this is a watermark of a perch, a fish that was used. Morris's initials, WM, are surrounding the fish. And it's lovely to look at this paper as well as the images and the text. Here's the half title, The Works of Geoffrey Chaucer, the table of contents. And then we finally come to the first opening pages. This is a remarkable opening, and if I had a group of students here, usually when I open to this, I often hear oohs and ahs because it really is striking to see this remarkable presentation. There are several things to note when we look at this book. First is there's a harmony of text and illustration in this book. This is what Morris and his collaborators were aiming for, and this too recalls some of the works of the earlier times. They see text, in other words, as being in harmony with all of the decoration and illustration surrounding it. You can see very elaborate borders, floral borders. These were all drawn by Morris. They continue throughout the book on many of its pages. And then in looking at the text itself, we can see the text is in an unusual font, a black letter font, and this is called the Chaucer font. The Kelmscott Press employed 3 different typefaces, and one of them was called the Chaucer. This was drawn from their Troy type, and it was made specifically for this book because it had to be smaller in order to have all of the works of Chaucer in one book. There were over 500 pages to this book, so you can imagine if the type was larger, it would have been even longer than that. But the black letter typeface is recalling that earlier time. Also, we're immediately drawn to some of the illustrations. And as I say, the illustrations were done by Morris's longtime friend, Edward Burne-Jones, one of the most important artists of the Victorian period. Burne-Jones selected the aspects of Chaucer that he wanted to illustrate. This is very interesting because up until this time, especially for the Canterbury Tales, typically the tales would be illustrated, but Burne-Jones was one of the first to illustrate not just the teller of the tales, such as the knight or the miller, but actually what is happening in the tales. This first illustration you can see is very reminiscent of the arts and crafts period. And as I say, is a wonderful opening to the book. Burne-Jones produced 87 illustrations for the book. I'll show you another one here. This is the one beginning the Knight's Tale. And you can see again borders by Morris, the Chaucer type, and then the illustration by Burne-Jones. The drawings, I should say, were done by Burne-Jones, but they were then engraved by W.H. Hooper so that they could be printed in the book here. Anyway, we don't have time to go through the entire book, but I think just in looking at these few examples, you get a sense of a wonderful production. Vassar is also fortunate to have another copy of the Kelmscott-Chaucer. And this book is actually different in many ways from the copy that I just showed you. This book, I should say, too, was adopted in honor of Sarah Hebblethwaite, who is a member of the London Vassar Club. Anyway, as you can see, this book is in a very different binding from the first Kelmscott-Chaucer. We don't have here a quarter linen binding with simple blue-gray boards. Here you can see we have a very elaborate binding in goatskin, often noted as one of the most luxurious kinds of bindings that you can have. The spine is impressed in gilt or gold leaf. And so anyone seeing a book like this, before even opening it, would be immediately aware that this was something special. We have some more details about the binding. If we open it up, at the bottom it tells us that it was bound by Riviere and Son. And Riviere binders were some of the most luxurious binders in London at the end of the 19th century. We have many books in special collections that were bound by Riviere and Son, and it shows us that when this book was bound, someone really thought that this was a special book. This book was given to us, as you can see from this book plate, by Mabel Rossbach. She was not an alum of Vassar, but she had many family members who attended Vassar, including Francis Lehman Loeb. And she became interested in donating her collection of books to Vassar, and one of its high points is the Kelmscott-Chaucer. So I love when I'm teaching that I can show these two different bindings, because they show two different aspects of how this book was appreciated at the time when it was printed. One other unique aspect of this book is if we turn past some of the opening pages, we can see that there's actually a letter tipped in, an original letter of William Morris, addressed to Mr. Mitford. This is written in 1881, and it's written from 26 Queen Square. Queen Square, 26 Queen Square, is actually where Morris and Company had its offices. So he's clearly writing this letter to Mitford from his offices, and if we read the letter, we see that he's asking him to meet him at Kelmscott House, not Kelmscott Manor, but Kelmscott House, which was located in the upper mall of Hammersmith in the western area of London. So we have that wonderful tie directly to Morris through that letter. And then it's interesting, again, to look at all the individual pages of this book as well. One last example that I want to show you is this fine press facsimile of the Kelmscott-Chaucer that we have. This was printed in 1974 by the Basilisk Press, again, a London fine press. I've shown it to you this way so you can see how lovely its binding is. Very different from the other two that I showed you. This is actually a cloth binding, and the design, if you look closely, is very much as you would expect to be produced from Morris and Company. And this was an original design called the Larkspur design, created by Morris in the 1870s. So the producers of this book thought that that would be a wonderful binding for their version of the book. You can see it's 2 volumes, and it's 2 volumes because the first volume is the actual facsimile of the Kelmscott-Chaucer. We won't have to spend too much time looking at that. The second volume is a companion volume, and this is very interesting because it has several essays on the history of the original Kelmscott-Chaucer. You can see it opens here with lovely illustrations of both Morris and Burne-Jones. And the essays here are actually about focus on Burne-Jones and his creation of the illustrations. And they include examples of his drawings. Here are some examples. So these would be the pencil drawings that Burne-Jones first created, and then these would eventually have turned into other drawings and eventually the engravings that appear in the book itself. But I think that provides a wonderful complement to go behind the scenes a little bit to see how Burne-Jones worked and how we eventually come to the wonderful product that we have there. As I say, it's wonderful to teach from all these volumes, to talk about this beautiful book. It's wonderful that we can show these books up close to students when we're teaching. If you're especially interested in this topic, there are many other books that you can read to learn about it. I'm sure you can search on the internet and find information there. There's also a famous history of the Kelmscott Press by William Peterson, and I would recommend you getting this from your local library or even purchasing it if you'd like to explore further the work that Morris was doing at that Kelmscott Press. So thank you for spending some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about these books, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to discuss and talk with you further.